Moss versus lichen. Oi, moss, this is my stone. No, it's not. 10 years later, get off. It's gonna make me. 50 years later, that's it, I'm coming over. Come on then. 100 years later, you'll be sorry when I get there. You're the one who'll be sorry. Earliest land plants, not the fastest movers in the world. Land plants, ancestors are algae, but algae has very little in the way of structure, maybe a little thing to hold itself down in the surf zone, a little bit of reinforcement that allowed them to maybe get in shallow water and tidal pools to get above the water where the light was stronger. But land plants have a lot more now. They don't always have what are official leaves and official shoots, or even cuticles, but this is what eventually they will have, or official roots for that matter. What the heck is an official root? Does somebody have to get clearance from the government? Okay, here's a cladogram, sort of. Going back 500 million years, so going back 500 million years. And this is somewhere back before this would have been eukaryote cells. Here you've got the split off of the algae. Now you get remember the kingdom plant, they kicked the algae out. Here's where the plant started. You get the mosses, which we're gonna talk about. You get plants with tubes in them so that can move water. And then you've got the ferns, you've got seeds, and then you've got gymnosperms, which include the conifers, and then you get the flowering plants, the angiosperms, which you can see split off back kind of in the middle of the dinosaur era, sort of. Primitive is an iffy word to use, but it's very commonly used. We tend to think of that meaning that it's simple or that there's something, not quite as far along. But in a lot of cases, it means these are very old groups. These are kind of the early groups, the first groups. Now the lichens, I have heard people pronounce it lichens, but typically it's called lichens. You'll see them on rocks. They almost look like a greenish scale right on the surface of the rocks. You get up into the Adirondacks, you'll see it. Sometimes you'll see them on trees as well. They are a weird combination. And they're not technically land plants, but they're the first things that successfully kind of got out of the water. This is a combination of an algae and at least one species of fungus that work together to support each other. Is that the plant part can make fuel, photosynthesis. The fungus part can fix nitrogen from the atmosphere into nitrates so that everybody gets to make proteins. And it's been a pretty good relationship. I've used this term before. I'm just going to write it down here. The world is full of relationships between species, and different types of relationships get different names. In a symbiosis, the relationship involves two species where both of them are getting something out of the relationship. Most of the little guys, I don't know about most, but a lot of the little guys who live in our colon do stuff for us, and we give them a good place to live with a pretty decent food source, away from oxygen, because they're not happy with oxygen. The funguses that fix nitrogen for land plants, get fuel, a nice protected place to live, and give nitrates to their partners. So that's a symbiosis. Later on, we'll talk about parasites, where one of the two gets a benefit and the other one gets some sort of, I don't want to say harm, but it's giving something up that it would otherwise use in the case of a parasite. And then you get what's called a commensal, where one side benefits and the other side isn't really hurt in any particular way. There's probably a lot of bacteria that live on us that don't really do anything for us, but they don't hurt us. We give them a nice place to live and some other benefits, and that's a commensal. Now, the first group that's really in the plants are the bryophytes. The mosses. These, if you look, you've seen these. They grow on surfaces. They look like a little fuzzy green surface. In wet soils, you'll see mosses grow. Leaf, in the forest on a lot of surfaces, on rocks, like in the cartoon, you'll see mosses grow. And there are other things in the group, notably something called liverworts, which are a little bit less obvious out in the world. They don't have real roots, stems, or leaves. What does that mean? They do not have an internal system of tubes to move stuff around. They're non-vascular. And if you have something that looks like a leaf but it doesn't have vascular tubes in it, it's not considered a leaf. If you have what looks like a stem and it doesn't have tubes in it, it's not considered a stem. If you have what looks like roots and it doesn't, you get the idea. And these are fully non-vascular plants. Water just moves by moving from a high concentration area to a low concentration area. There's very much limits kind of their sizes. But this is the first place we're going to see this in plants. When we talked about alternation of generations, where your life cycle goes back and forth between sexual and asexual, or asexual and sexual, but it's a pattern that you always see in any lifetime for a single moss. It goes through a sexual stage and an asexual stage. And since it's a cycle, there is no real first. First is, where you jump on the merry-go-round. Now, the asexual form makes genetic copies, right? That's what asexual reproduction does. And usually generates spores. The sporophytes are the distribution system, is that it's a way to spread across the land. Spores fly through the air and settle someplace. What grows out of the spores, when the spores find a nice wet place to live, they will generate a gametophyte in some groups. In some groups, they will generate a moss, and the gametophytes will grow on the mosses. They'll sprout on the mosses. Now, there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on that we're not going to get into. Remember, eukaryotes have 2 sets of chromosomes, except they don't always. If they only have 1 set of chromosomes, they're called haploid. If they have 2 sets, they're called diploid. You'll notice that the haploid gets an N and diploid gets a 2N, and that shows up here. Don't really care if you follow along with that part of it. I know it's up here, so I didn't want to ignore it. But we're just going to talk about basic function. There's 3 different variations. You get a gametophyte on a sporophyte. You get separate forms. This is what you get in the ferns. Or you get kind of a large one. Basically, the sporophyte is going to produce spores that have only one set of chromosomes in them. I'm already regretting having put that up there. This will be clearer. Here's a moss. There's the moss growing on these things that look like leaves and stems, but no tubes inside, so they're not technically leaves and stems. And this part of it on the bottom is the gametophyte. It's the sexually reproducing organism. It can produce sperm and egg cells. Sperm and eggs. And then what can generate off the tops of these little things that look like seed pods are actually spore capsules. And those are sporophytes. The spores are reproduced as genetic copies of the gametophyte. They land somewhere and grow a new one of these. Okay, now we got to get into some basics. When things reproduce sexually, it produces offspring that are genetically different from the original 2 sources. Usually that involves a source that generates one set of chromosomes of the 2 that it has, and another source that generates one set of chromosomes of the 2 that it has. So the way that you mix them, even if one organism by itself can do this, you get different mixtures of chromosomes because you're sorting through each pair to get your one set. Now gender, the way that I learned it, I'm not sure it's a term right now that's kind of in flux. It may not mean the same thing for a while, but there's some argument over this. But the way I learned gender, so the way I'm teaching gender, is that in things that reproduce sexually, gender is are roles recognized in sexually reproducing organisms. And you always got a pair, right? 2 sources, but sometimes there's upwards of 30-some different roles that they could each be playing. And in some funguses, that's true, where some funguses typically have 18 genders, dependent on circumstances. So each one of the pair has, kind of 18 different things it could play. There's a couple that don't pair up right. By far, the most common gender setup is male and female. And that happens in the mosses as well. Now, when you think male and female, you don't tend to think little bitty plants, because you're thinking the stuff that isn't really bottom line male and female. You're thinking about the add-on stuff that you get in animals, specifically that you get in mammals. But male and female is a very specific thing with very specific differences. And it comes down to, what are you making? Bottom line, males produce sperm. Females produce egg cells, better technically known as ova. And all of the differences grow from that, because these have 2 very different functions. They each contribute one set of chromosomes to the offspring, but how it gets together varies a lot. And here's the big deal. You would like your offspring to be able to survive. So the best way to do that is to give them a head start of food. Give them food so that they can grow and develop to a point where they can survive on their own. They can feed themselves. It's true for plants too. Because you got to get the plant so it can photosynthesize. And if you're sending a spore out there, that gets a little tricky. But with an egg cell, you put food into the cell that's going to contribute to the offspring. Could be a little food, could be a lot of food. It depends on what the offspring's going to need in order to get by. That requires a large cell. Sperm don't do that. So they can be a lot smaller. Now we get to the other function. Bigger cells are not as mobile. So the egg cells are not mobile, is that they don't move through the world. The best they are in some ocean animals is they're dropped in the neighborhood. So how do these cells get together? That's where the sperm are functional. Sperm have a way to get to where the egg cells are. Now, the first thing you tend to think about is sperm as they're little swimmy guys. And a huge number of sperm, including plant sperm, are little swimmy guys. But that's not the only way they have to get around. In some worms, they're little crawly guys, is that they move around like amoebas or like white blood cells. In advanced plants, they're packaged in pollen. And the pollen has a whole bunch of different ways to get to where the egg cells are. From the flower where the pollen's produced to another flower where the egg cells are waiting in the base. So this is not always swimming. And these guys are not moving much. Is that wherever they are, the sperm have got to get to them. Any cell that you're going to dump a lot of food into is metabolically expensive. It takes a lot of resources to make these guys. So the female individuals don't crank out anywhere near as many of them. On top of that, the odds of the sperm getting to where there's an egg cell are not great. So how do you up the odds? You crank out way more of them. Now, sometimes people remember this wrong, because they get humans stuck in their head and they go, oh, well, we only make one egg cell. And I'll tell you the truth, that's not even true for humans. In any typical monthly cycle for a human female, 4 to 7 egg cells are started out. It's necessary because without that, you don't crank out the right amount of hormones to get the system working. Typically, they fight with each other hormonally so that only one gets released into the system. But even in humans, it's not one versus a bunch. It's, not as many against way more. In some situations, hundreds of thousands of egg cells are made. If that's true, millions of sperm are made. It's always a comparative number within a species. Oops. Sorry, I put that down backwards. The screen I'm looking at, in order to see what's going on here, is reversed, and sometimes I reverse what I'm doing when I write it down. When I went to write down again, I noticed now there's way more sperm made and fewer egg cells, so switch those around. Okay, I'm just gonna say this quickly. You don't need to know these details, but sometimes the details help people to remember stuff. Whenever you're gonna make a sperm or an egg cell, it's a cell production system. And your production system starts the same way it would for making any cells. It copies all of your DNA. You have two sets of chromosomes. Before you start this, you have 4 sets of chromosomes. Each of these is gonna only get 1 set of chromosomes so that they can recombine and get the 2 back. But that means that you're dealing ultimately with 4 chromosomes. If you're making egg cells, you don't want to take your production cell and divide it into quarters and divide your food into quarters. That would not be good for your offspring. So the food stays in one of the 4 cells. So you make only 1 functional egg cell. But you also got to get rid of those extra chromosomes that you made that you don't need. And so you wind up with 3 little bitty cells called polar bodies that literally are just little discards. Is just a tiny cell with a set of chromosomes in them that you need to get rid of. Well, of course, with sperm, you need to crank out a bunch of these things. And there's no, holding food in one spot. So for every production cell, and there's way more production cells than there are on the egg cell side, you're gonna make 4 working sperm, each with 1 set of chromosomes in it. And these are the basic differences between sperm and egg cells, and the differences between males and females. Where I went to school is that there was a line of trees along the road right behind the biology building of ginkgo trees. Ginkgo trees are an ornamental tree imported from Australia. But unusual for trees, ginkgo trees are separate males and separate females. There's other plants like that. Some of you know some other plants like that. But this is how you can tell the difference. What kind of reproductive cells are they making? It's not like you sneak up to a ginkgo tree and lift its leaves looking for little noogies to tell if it's a male, because that isn't the way it works. It's whether it's making egg cells or sperm. Now when we get to, or what we did in the genetics lab is we talked about where you have a situation in a species where there are male individuals and female individuals, not commonly true in plants. Then there's different ways to cause the male to develop as male and cause the females to develop as females. We've gone over that. That's a separate issue. And it's different in all sorts of different living things that have what are called dioecious, have separate males and females. The last thing to talk about with this group is when the sperm is made, the egg cells are made in the base of those, of the gametophyte, is that they get wet. It rains on the moss, dew forms on the moss, and that's how the sperm gets to where the egg cell is. There are swimming sperm in mosses, and because mosses live on surfaces anyway, then they can kind of get by with the sperm getting, it can't travel very far, right, through the water. The spores can spread mosses much more far and wide. And they do that, since they do that asexually, they don't have to depend on 2 cells finding each other once they're out in the world. They just need it to be wet enough where they land. So that's the Bryophytes. That's the first of the primitive land plant groups.